animals in the transition period in the first days postpartum will experience elevations in ketones, mostly beta hydroxybutyrate, BHB, which is the major ketone. And we relate that to issues. So because we relate that to issues in the cows that could be reproductive related or productive related, then we say, okay, A and B are connected, therefore A must be a problem, meaning ketosis is a disease. And we have understood for a long time ketosis is a disease.
Welcome back to the Dairy Podcast Show. My name is Barry Bradford from Michigan State University. Today, I'm very pleased to welcome to the show Dr. Eduardo Rico, who is an assistant professor at the University of Maryland. Eduardo, thanks for coming to join us on the show today.
Thank you, Barry, for having me.
So I always like to start out with getting a little bit of somebody's background. Did you grow up in agriculture? What got you in this space? It's interesting, the range of backgrounds people have. How about yourself?
Yeah, I cannot claim a background in agriculture. My family used to have land and farms and animals, but a couple generations ago.
Okay.
And something happened. Then we got the disconnect a couple generations with nothing. So I grew up suburban.
Uh-huh.
I was actually closer to study music formally, conservatory and everything, than to get into the animal sciences. But then by serendipity, I guess you call it, I knew I liked biology, and I loved animals, but I didn't want to be a vet. And so I kind of fell into, animal science is a thing. And that's kind of how I got into it. And particularly in the nutrition side. What drove me as a consumer actually was that agriculture has to do something with nutrition and with promoting health potentially in humans. Kind of the idea resonated with me. I knew I didn't want to be an Animal Planet, host like Steve Irwin or Jeff Corwin and stuff like that. I like those things, but biology I like, but not vet. What is it? So animal science kind of fell into place, and particularly nutrition, because we can answer boxes of questions about how this black box works, right? For animal, including us. And so that's what made me tick, and I explored it, and luckily I liked it. I didn't have to change paths, and then here we are. Roll forward, 20 years.
Your partner in improving animal performance, Berg & Schmidt. They provide high-quality, economical feed ingredients for ruminants, like their well-researched coated nutrients and fat powders that can support cows with additional available energy, which improves their overall health, productive performance, and your cost efficiency.
Fascinating. I got to ask, what instrument or instruments did you play, or was it more vocal?
Well, there was vocals, there was trumpet, symphony band, symphony orchestra, and then more recently flute, traverse flute. So try to keep it, but it's not the main thing anymore.
Yeah, I understand. Yeah. And where did you grow up?
So I'm originally from Colombia.
Okay.
Yep. The highlands of Colombia, the capital is Bogota, so very close to there. That's where I did my bachelor's also, in the National University. And yeah, basically Highlander.
Yeah.
Cold regions, I guess, of Colombia, because most of it is very, very hot. But I just happen to grow up in a very, I guess, relatively cold by comparison area.
Right.
So it's always like spring weather, I guess. It's not terrible. It's evergreen. And yeah, no seasons. Yeah, sounds nice.
What kind of elevation?
So I have to convert to feet. So probably 8,000 feet.
Okay.
Something like that. 2,600 meters above sea level. Closer to the stars, as we say.
Right. There you
go. Yeah, and then, so that was my upbringing. I did college there, animal science, and then I got an opportunity to get into the feed industry because of my liking of nutrition.
Yep.
And so I got an opportunity right out of college to go to formulate diets. So I got to work in a company where we were formulating a lot of diets for dairy, supplements, full TMR diets, a lot of grazing in Colombia, by the way. Supplements, mineral, vitamins. So it was a very good learning experience on real hands, stuff that means money to producers.
Right.
A lot of interactions with producers. And so a formative experience, I think, is an applied nutritionist. And that was my first thing. I did it for almost 5 years over there. But I also got to do some of other things that I like, which is a little bit of science communication, a little bit of formulating diets also for pets.
Okay.
Which is, I also like that area, but it's much smaller than my dairy. horses even, and which ties back to my interest in lipids, because a lot of that work was done with horses and dogs that was lipid related, omega-3 fatty acids, things
Oh,
like
sure.
that really, energy metabolism. So it kind of all blended together, gave me a very well-rounded experience, and that was amazing. But I knew I was itching to do something else related to science, and that's what I went to Michigan State, actually, back in 2011. So that's kind of like how the story in the US starts.
Was it that you were formulating and you just felt like there's more you wanted to understand, or you just felt like you wanted to be challenged more in your role?
Yeah, I mean, I was basically a vehicle for transmission of science, of knowledge,
Yeah.
and for doing diets. And it was like I reached the point of the pinnacle of what I could do over there. So I got that experience, which was challenging to really get a good handle on nutrition and applied nutrition.
Yep.
But then it was kind of like, okay, this is done. What else? I need to answer questions, because I am very inquisitive, curious by nature. So I needed to scratch that itch, and that's what the master's opportunity gave me, right? And I didn't look back from that. I mean, I can still do applied stuff, and I do sometimes engaging and working on diets and formulation, even for consulting and things like that. But it's not the main thing anymore. Now it's more like I get to answer my questions. Right now, I'm extremely happy because I get to answer the questions that I have, right, within reason, of course. It has
Right.
to be beneficial somehow. But yes, that's the path, I think.
That's great. So you went to Michigan State, got a master's there, and then where did your path lead from there?
So that was a focus on somewhat a transition, applied lipid nutrition with Adam Locke,
Yep.
right? A lot of saturated fat feeding and things like that. And then I wanted to explore more metabolism. So at the time, Joe McFadden, who's now at Cornell, was starting his position at West Virginia University. And he was the one working on the omics thing. And I thought omics is metabolomics. It's like a gateway to understand what's happening inside of that black box, what we do with nutrition, what is changing inside in the system. So systems biology and all of those things, it seemed like a really good thing to get into to expand my horizons. I actually got the chance to learn a bunch of biochemistry from that, which was one of my fears in university.
Sure.
So overcome your fears, face them head on, get into something exciting. That got me into biomarkers and to other stuff that I needed to understand better. So that was the work. We work on insulin resistance. We work on sphingolipids, ceramides, things that were not very well known at the time. So yeah, it kind of like kept expanding on the range of things that I could talk about, at least, right? And it was good. Then that was for 3.5 years, I think, and then postdoc at Cornell. Again with him. I guess we got along well for a while.
Right.
So, so that gave me a chance to piggyback on these topics and expand a little bit more. We did a lot of work on dairy cows, of course, and from that I just felt like ready enough to start exploring my own thing after the postdoc, and then here we are.
And now you've been at the University of Maryland for how long now?
3 years, since 2021. So it was kind of an anticlimactic start because no one to greet you and no one to say goodbye in the previous
Sure.
place. We were all locked in the lockdown, but it's been great. It's slowly but surely.
Fantastic. Well, good for you.
Thank you.
So tell me a little bit about your position. I know you have some research component, but yeah, what's your split of responsibilities there?
70% research, 30% teaching, but that also includes service. So most of my time I spent doing research, and I have a program that I'm building on energy metabolism with a particular focus on understanding, controlling ketosis, I guess, and some other things that branch out from that. So that the main focus is always nutrition and energy metabolism.
Okay.
For the most part. Then I am teaching dairy management. I'm teaching comparative nutrition and some grad courses on metabolism. So
Nice.
From the teaching side, I'm very, very, very excited because it really gives me the opportunity to talk about many different things. You focus a lot on cows, on the dairy management, but then you get to talk about metabolic diseases in humans and animals. And so it's just exciting stuff for me.
That's great. It's fun to talk to somebody who enjoys their job so much. It's nice to hear.
Well, just it scratches my itch on the answering questions, right? So I get to talk about it. So happy as can be, I guess.
Great. Well, let's dig in a little bit to that energy metabolism ketosis piece. Probably most people listening are familiar with ketosis, but it probably wouldn't hurt to take a minute. And how would you define ketosis to somebody that hasn't ever heard that term before.
Well, I guess I have to preface with saying that there is some degree of confusion that is not intentional in the definitions of how people perceive ketosis,
Yeah.
right? We have been talking about ketosis for over 100 years. And it was described originally as a disorder around parturition that was called mania puerperalis or mania puerperalis, which is some sort of craze that arrived to animals that were around this period, and we couldn't really explain it. It was more like a syndrome. And it coincided with elevations in some things like ketones. And the one that we could measure the best was BHB. So it kind of like came from that there was something that we don't understand that is happening around calving, and animals are just suffering from this. In this case, it was a kind of like neurological disorder to the most extreme manifestations. So that was a very clinical side. And then over time, it has changed, right? Because we can measure it. Now we call animals in the transition period in the first days postpartum will experience elevations in ketones, mostly beta hydroxybutyrate, BHB, which is the major ketone. And we relate that to issues. So because we relate that to issues in the cows that could be reproductive related or productive related, then we say, okay, A and B are connected, therefore A must be a problem, meaning ketosis is a disease. And we have understood for a long time ketosis is a disease, which you can draw parallels to human biomedical sciences, because in humans, when we talk about ketosis for many, many decades, it was a big scare too. Diabetic ketoacidosis. People with type 1 diabetes will suffer these elevations also in ketones in their blood, and that was terrible. Before insulin, it was a death sentence, right? So there is a lot of negative that came in the human world and also in the cow world from being able to measure ketones and relate it to moments in which things were going really, really bad. So I think that shaped a lot of our understanding.
Mm-hmm.
But I guess I'm interested in that topic because it has become riddled with paradoxes, that you don't always have animals that are performing poorly when they have elevated ketones. And then in some cases, the predictive power of the ketone on the negative outcome that you anticipate is not there. But so a lot of contradictions, a lot of things that we tell me that we don't understand that very well. And so that's the reason to get into it, because as I said, 100 plus years talking about this subject, and we still have a very, very dismal rate of success in controlling it. It's like 50% of effectiveness in the treatments, prophylactic or after, in the resolution of ketosis. There has been great work trying to explore how to do this, how to improve it, but we still have not made all the progress we should. So the question I'm trying to ask now is why, or we have been for a while because we started in the pandemic with this. Why have we not made so much progress on this? And if this is such a big gateway disease for cows to become, go and suffer the cascade of other diseases and issues, including infections, we should get a handle on this, right? What are we doing that is not effective enough that we should probably rethink to approach this better? So that's the root of what the interest in ketosis is. And I'll finalize by saying, in humans, ketosis is not anymore such a terrible, fearful thing, right? We even talk about inducing ketosis and the ketogenic diet, nutritional ketosis, and are you hitting your targets on the ketones? People buy the meters, measure themselves, and and you can make a case for maybe that's not what we should be doing necessarily. It depends on how you see this in human science, but that's not the point right now. Point is that at least it's not as harmful as it was. And on the flip side of that, we have seen that ketones are potent anti-inflammatory substances too, that you can use them to treat things like gout in humans, to remove those crystals and to reverse things like cirrhotic fatty liver. Some epilepsy treatments are based on ketogenic diets. So a lot of positives. And I'm thinking, is it all that bad in cows all of the time? Or could it be something that we look at this situation of ketosis in a different light? So that's long story long, I guess I made that.
I want to take one half a step back real quick. So this class of ketosis is named for this class of chemicals called ketones, right? Or ketone bodies. And beta hydroxybutyrate, or BHB, is one of those chemicals that we can most easily measure, as you said. So real quickly, where do those chemicals come from, and like anatomically, biochemically?
So cows can make ketones naturally. We usually think of a ketosis in the peripartum as something that is coming from the liver, And it's true that it's most of the ketones that are coming from that liver. The animal is experiencing what we usually call negative energy balance. So the adipose tissue, the fat stores are being mobilized to supply the demand of energy because it's insufficient, right? Cows are making more and more milk. Overnight, they increase their requirements for energy, and there is not enough energy being consumed to go around. So they start taking from the reserves, which is, you could argue, a perfectly normal adaptation, right? Take your fat stores, which many animals do. You can think about hibernating animals and things like that. It's a normal thing in nature.
Mm-hmm.
Cows do it in that period in particular, wide awake. And the liver is processing all of that fat, what we call the NIFA or non-esterified fatty acids, arrive in that liver. They are partially oxidized, partially broken down to produce these precious molecules. There is at least 3 ketones that we could talk about: BHB, acetoacetate, and acetone. But in practice, the one that represents most of it is BHB. So that's in practice, it makes more sense to talk about it. Acetone actually is exhaled very quickly, and it just vanishes. So it's good that we can measure that particular major molecule, and it's coming mostly from the liver. But having said that, it can also be produced as a consequence of dietary aspects. So the rumen in particular, which is one of those things that not everyone necessarily is aware about, can make ketones. The gastrointestinal tract of cows and other mammals can make ketones by taking things like butyrate. So you can give molasses to a cow, you can give them alfalfa, and you get butyrate fermentations that are completely normal. And the epithelium of that rumen is going to make ketones that you can measure actually in the blood. And that's actually one of those mechanisms that we're trying to hijack as we try to understand ketosis, by giving them sources of butyrate so that the rumen can produce those ketones, and we can actually cause hyperketonemia, which is high ketones in blood, and to study it, right? If you want to study something, you need to control it. And so we're trying to get into control experimentation with that. But 2 places, right? So the liver is one that we usually think about for this, for ketosis, is working extra hard to get energy supplied to the other tissues. It's kind of like a selfless tissue that is producing things, doesn't burn them themselves, just give away, very generous. But then there's the rumen too. And that relates to the benign ketosis. When you find dietary situations in which ketosis is there, by definition of ketones, but the animals are not presenting any negative symptoms. So that kind of talks about the paradox. The same molecule can be good and evil. How come? Right? It makes you scratch your head, because we're really using, and we have been using this for a long time, as a predictor of poor fertility or poor production outcomes. And it doesn't stand the test of scrutiny when you have studies that are actually showing the opposite thing. So there's a lot to unpack there, but let's start by saying, yes, you can make it in 2 places.
So what are you kind of alluded to this already, but you did a nice job of setting the stage of some of the history of our understanding of ketosis and some of the open questions and the paradoxes now. So what are some of the core questions you're trying to tackle right now? You kind of alluded to one.
Well, there's 2 areas. And generally speaking, are they really that bad?
Mm-hmm.
Are there elevations in ketones to the subclinical and clinical level really causing the animals to display negative health outcomes or the reduced productivity? Are they really the evils that we think? That's the first one. And the second one is more kind of like out there. It's based on the biomedical science literature that tells us that ketones can actually be anti-inflammatory substance and can actually be good for reversing a number of chronic diseases in humans. These have the potential, even in cancers. I didn't mention cancers, but some cancers actually who thrive on glucose and amino acids, when you starve them of that and you give these individual ketones, you could actually be improving the outcomes in some cancer patients. It's not a cure for everything, but could be like a co-treatment. So this is all happening in the human world, and we want to see if in the cow, could there be any potential to attenuate inflammation in clinical moments? And so that's kind of like the idea that is more out there. First, we have to figure out, is it really that bad? So there's a question of yes or no there, and when. And then second, can they actually be good, used for something that is therapeutic? Can ketones be a therapy? So probably that may sound counterintuitive to people who tend to view ketones in a very negative light. But we have the lack of being in research, and we can explore those 2 ideas kind of like at the same time. And so those are, I think, the two big areas. The way we try to tackle them is by doing control experimentation, because as it happens, ketone research for many years has been based on A is related to B. And it's not bad. There is a place for that, and it could really inform what we need to do. It gives us a direction in which we can go. But now the question is really A causing B? So for that, you really need to induce ketosis and not change anything else. And so that brings us to the topic of what models can you use? How tricky is there a perfect model for inducing ketosis? And can you really, answer that question, which has been eluding us for so much time? So that's the big picture of what we want to do: the positives and the negatives, and shedding light on what it is and what is not.
Fascinating. So I don't necessarily want to make you try to make you spill all your beans, but I'm curious if you've used sort of dietary treatments to try to induce greater BHB production in the rumen epithelium, for example. What kind of concentrations have you been able to achieve with just that sort of intervention?
So it has been short term. I have to clarify. It has been short term. We have been doing things that are 12, 24 hours, 48 hours. We have been trying to monitor in reduced number of animals whether this induction of ketosis with a dose response, you get from the 0 level to below subclinical, then above clinical. We have been hitting all of those numbers: the 1.2 millimolar, the 2.0, the 3.0.
Wow.
Short term, without having the cows experience negative effects like the neurological signs or anything that is telling us the ketones themselves are really creating an issue that you can observe acutely. So at least acutely, they don't seem to be that big thing. And this is data that we still have to publish, so I'll put a caveat on that. It needs to be peer reviewed, but that's something that we have been able to repeat in a couple of experiments. So one of them was going in the different levels up to clinical over a period of 12 hours. So short term, we didn't see negatives. Then the other ones, we tried to mimic the normal curve of ketones above the subclinical level over the course of a day. And we did this experiment for over a week, repeated. We use Latin squares a lot. So repeat the experiments in the same individuals a couple of times. And so what we have seen is not what we expected, based on the premise that, the ketones at a high level could be so acutely terrible, which is what you see in a cow. In the first week, probably you'll have an animal that is clinically down, and you say, well, ketones are elevated, and you measure the 3.0 mark, and you say, well, ketones are doing something bad here, right? By association. They're culprits by association. Could they be firemen? Could there be actually there as a consequence of a normal response, emergency services that come to the aid? So because they're always there, we're going to keep on blaming the firemen until we don't disentangle that. And it could be that they are doing something wrong. It's just short term, we haven't seen it.
I like that fireman analogy. Yeah, sometimes I use the one of, why would I, if I'm sick, why would I go to the hospital? It's full of sick people. Obviously, that must be what makes people sick, right?
Right.
That sort of cause and effect complexity that's difficult. Well, I'm amazed that I didn't actually think you could achieve 3 millimolar BHB with dietary interventions. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, we're using calcium butyrate. There could be other ways, but we're trying to use concentrated butyrate. The challenge with that is that it's terrible. It smells so bad.
Yeah, sure.
So cows know better. And so we have been working, there's a couple of products from companies that have been trying to do better with that. So no need to go too much into detail there, but the point is that we need to somewhat protect the animal from that, offensive smell that butyrate can have. Like with a poorly fermented silage, right? We talk about these butyric fermentations. Yeah, it's butyric acid. That's what we're giving. So it could be great for inducing ketosis in the sense that the rumen can make those ketones from that, but it's a challenge to get the cows to eat it.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we have put in the rumen in the dose response, just for clarity. In the dose response experiment, we put it inside of the rumen of fistulated animals so that we could actually control it. Again, because the point is control. If you leave it, to their devices, then probably will not really be, as controlled as you want it to, and you will not answer the question so precisely.
Yep. You kind of started to point to this, but one of the challenges with the relationship research, right, is that it's looking at one factor that's changed in a imperfect scenario, if you will, and relating that to the outcome. But we know today, maybe we didn't know 100 years ago, but we know today that there's probably 50 other things that have changed sort of along with that.
Yeah.
One group that I think has done some nice work in that space is Fabio Lima's team. They've shown, and I just want to bounce this off you and get your feedback. They've shown if you take sort of an epidemiological approach and look at many animals and do that sort of relationship work, but then I also ask if the hyperketonemia or the ketosis comes with hypoglycemia versus not, do you see different outcomes? Have you followed that research?
Well, just superficially, I haven't seen in detail.
Okay.
What I can tell you from that, I mean, we're going to discuss the biomarkers and the many 50 things that you mentioned that are changing, because that's
Right.
important. But there could be conditionally problematic, which is probably what you're hinting on. If the cow is hypoglycemic and she's really struggling, probably you will find a situation in which there is more of an issue there. Is that hypoglycemia because of the normal hypoglycemia of the cow, or is it because there is immune activation? In which case, you can actually put the factor of inflammation or uncontrolled inflammation into the equation, and then you have a third factor that is not there. And this is going into speculation, but the point is that it's not just one thing, right? Because we can measure this very thing so precisely, and we hyper focus on it, we may be missing the forest for the trees. And so to that extent, I think that that's how I see it, that the biomarker, which is ketone, could be useful, but the fact that it's so imprecise in predicting outcomes, unless we put the other cofactors together, is telling us that it's not the whole story, right?
Right.
So I don't know if that's what their research is showing, but the fact that you point to hypoglycemia tells me that that's kind of where it's heading, that there is conditions.
I think that's right. And part of the reason that I thought of that is you're mentioning the work from 100 years ago where they're relating this to basically clearly neurological issues. And my first reaction is, I bet it's hypoglycemia, because that is certainly across species an expectation with extreme hypoglycemia, right? You start to lose neurological function. Does that make sense to you or not?
Yeah, there is definitely degrees, and we see this in many species. There is a threshold below which the brain is so starved that it will shut down. It is risk of death even, right?
Yeah.
So neurological issues are kind of like short-circuiting, because there is like this spasmodic arrival of energy. The system is kind of like shutting up and down, but then it could be even worse, right? So we know that very clearly, that it's just bad. So it depends. Let me just go, before I forget, to the biomarkers and the 50 molecules that are changing at the same time.
Yeah.
Because I was excited about this work when I was with Joe McFadden doing a lot of metabolomics. So we try to do targeted metabolomics, trying to explore particular ideas and trying to find where this specific biomarker is really the one that is related to this condition. In this case, we were exploring insulin sensitivity in the peripartum. But that's an example of targeted metabolomics. When we're talking about biomarkers, and sometimes you're shooting in the dark and see what sticks, right? And that's untargeted metabolomics. So we can measure so many things now. Now that we have mass spectrometry, we could really go crazy in measuring everything, and it's so easy to get lost in that.
Yep.
Because it's very shiny. You talk about a molecule that no one knows, that is hard to pronounce, and you sound smart. And yeah, I don't have a problem with sounding smart. I like that, but it's not necessarily taking us in a better direction.
Right.
So we need to be mindful not to get lost in that shiny thing all the time. And so you have to have targeted approaches where you're really exploring a hypothesis, and you can also use the biomarker thing, which is exploratory, to find potential hypotheses. But you always need to land on something that is very specific. And that's what we have narrowed it down to. Okay, let's explore the role of ketones themselves, and then some cofactors that could be there. And that's the reason I mentioned inflammation. That's the reason I should mention, probably briefly, NIFA, or the free fatty acids, that are always related to ketones in the postpartum, but we cannot really measure easily as a cow-side test, right? It's just difficult to measure. There is some literature on this from vet schools. And so we measure what is easy, and sometimes that takes us a path. And the path is A is related to B sometimes. Now we can nuance that and say sometimes, not always. Why not always? Why do we have the paradox? So the thing with the ketones, I will say briefly, is that they are a biomarker, but they are not a perfect biomarker. right? They are related to something sometimes because they are not the only thing. A really good biomarker, when you look at the biomedical literature defining these things, is a marker that is independent. And how can ketones in the peripartum be independent of something else that is changing, like NIFA or uncontrolled inflammation? They are changing together, and if you cannot disentangle them, then you don't really have a good biomarker, which will explain why we don't have so much success using it as a predictor. It happens actually that NIFA is a better predictor of negative outcomes. There is literature from Cornell, I think, showing that. But we choose the one that is easier, not just because that's what we can do. It's nobody's fault, I think.
Yep. Good answers. Okay. You and I could chat about this all day, I'm sure. I'm curious, can we take this to putting yourself in the shoes of let's say a dairy veterinarian or a herdsman? You're maybe throwing some water on the policy of screening for ketones and having a strict treatment regimen, or maybe you're not. We have work to do. I think you and I completely agree on that, to really fully understand what ketones are all about and how they fit in the system and how we should think about. But somebody has to make decisions today on a farm, right? What would you recommend to them? How do you see the best policies or best procedures today based on what we know?
Well, I try to be careful not to. I don't want to dismiss practices, because I recently discussed this with a friend. Traditions or practices in this case are experiments that worked.
Yep.
Right. So in some situations, screening for ketones and giving this prophylactic treatment with propylene glycol, or treating the animals postpartum. It could be a calcium bolus. It could be whatever is bringing the animal down. There's a number of options, but you do what you have to do to rescue the situation. So I don't mean to say that we should not do that until we're not sure of ketones, what ketones do. So what could happen in some cases is that we have a false positive, that we are, maybe the animals recovered in those cases because of other factors that was not the treatment. But since it worked, we can kind of keep on repeating it. But I will also say that in many farms, this is something that probably many people have heard Lance Vanguard saying in Arizona, for example, in the Southwest. There are so many farms that for decades have not done anything with ketones, or don't worry about ketones. Yep. Right? It could be differences in the diets. It could be the predisposition of, related to the geographical area, related to propensity for infections. There is a number of factors that you could argue make for a difference. How much corn silage and grain do you use in a diet here versus there? Alfalfa is one example of things that sometimes seem to help. So don't change practices unless you're sure. But definitely we need to pay attention to what other options could be there. Is, for example, the prepartum program controlling inflammation more important than focusing on the prophylactic treatment with ketones? Probably yes. We don't know. Right. And I guess I don't wanna cast a negative light on treatments, because we're not there yet, right? So it's better sometimes be safe than sorry. But I will just argue for keeping a nuanced view on this, a possibility open to there could be something else that we don't understand. So if we keep on laser focused, approaching ketosis like the end goal, then we may be missing other stuff. And so that's the reason for which part of our ketosis experiments deal with the NIFAs and with the inflammation. We are trying to combine those things in controlled situations so that we can see how they relate. What is the solution, or what would be a novel solution for this? It's not something that I'm in a good position to say. Fair because what are the alternatives? I mean, if we think that this is an energy disorder, you try to give the animal some sources of glucose. You need to make those ketones go down, so you give them propylene glycol or a precursor so that the liver can make glucose, so you don't have to worry about making so much ketones. But we know that we have very partial success with that. So what is that other 50% of non-resolution? How can you explain it? And moreover, how can you prevent it? So I put my money right now on the inflammation question. There's a number of things that I think we should be doing in the postpartum, and I'll just briefly mention things like omega-3 fatty acids, vitamin D status, and even ketones, but that's really out there or a ketogenic diet for cows. But that's really, I would put my tinfoil for now hat and say that. But at least we should be open to those options. And we know that there are things in nutrition that are anti-inflammatory. There is some very good work that Dr. Sordillo made when she was producing this data related to vitamin D in particular, how that relates to postpartum issues. And I think we should explore that more, right? We know that for fighting infections and for controlling the activity of the immune system that is overreacting, vitamin D status seems to be an important thing. We saw that during COVID too. So I think that there is questions that we could explore more and to try to get us in a better place. But it comes from research, right?
Yep.
One step at a time. I mean, I'm focusing my little world of the ketones and the cofactors that could be, and maybe that just tells us, oh, maybe they're not so bad, right? And there is still the other things to do. But we need to answer that question, because if we keep on only thinking about ketones in such a negative light, maybe we're missing the opportunity to tackle other stuff.
Yep. Great.
So yeah, that was the best I could do with that, because it's difficult to say whether people should be doing things differently, and every situation is different. It would be kind of like, yeah, not unwarranted to say that. In many places, it could be doing it could be doing the trick. It could be the right thing there to do. In some places, maybe not.
Yep. I think that's fair. The right answer in extension is always it depends, right? And that's because it usually does depend.
Maybe it sounds political. I don't know. But it's just when you commit to this level of certainty, that you claim that it's probably, that makes me more distrusting personally. Like, no, really? I would rather hear a nuanced response.
I'm the same way. Yeah, I agree with you. And I like, you've got some great questions that, I'm excited for your next 10 years. I think you've got a nice series of questions that kind of build towards potential applications, right? But I agree with you. You have to focus a little bit, try to answer some clear questions up front, and then you can build on that. That's fantastic.
Yeah, we're trying to get our legs of the research going. So I said energy metabolism, ketosis is part of energy metabolism. But we're trying to take our clues from some other things that are happening in the human world related to longevity, for example, the role of mitochondria, the role of nicotinamide adenosine molecules, NAD or NAD+, redox states of the cells, things like that are more like we are not really thinking so much about in the dairy world.
Yep.
Related to energy metabolism that could be actually interesting. So we're trying to expand. This also relates to the ketone story, to be honest, but there is, an increasingly bigger field that could open, but we need to, kind of like go by steps. And so that's what we're trying to do.
Fantastic.
It's time for our famous three. Introducing Ultrasorb R3.0, Volac's comprehensive and complete solution to reduce the negative impact of naturally occurring toxins on ruminants. Ultrasorb R3.0 is a species-specific product designed to mitigate the effects of specific mycotoxins in the gastrointestinal tract of ruminants. Ultrasorb R3.0 also offers lipopolysaccharides binding capabilities. Endotoxins such as LPS can contribute to inflammation in ruminants, with energy partitioned to mount an immune response instead of production. Learn more about Ultrasorb R3.0 at volac.com.
All right, Eduardo, we've got 3 questions we have to throw at all of our guests at the end, so looking forward to seeing what your thoughts are here. So first of all, what's your favorite dairy-related book or resource that you turn to?
Well, I guess in terms of resources, being people in academia, the usual answer you will find is the Journal of Dairy Science, which is the top journal in our field. You see most of the innovative ideas or big data stuff related recently showing up there, right? And because it's peer-reviewed, you know that it was not something that most likely was done poorly, but it was well executed because we have a very rigorous system. So I think that tends to be the best resource for keeping up to date with what's happening. Yeah, I would say that. But there's also popular literature that I would say that people should stay in tune with. So I don't know if that's part of that question or I could bring it up.
Sure.
But
yeah.
There are things that you could see related to critical things like climate change and the role of agriculture on that and what we have done. So there's resources that even like the FAO or FAO, I don't know how you say that in English, but are producing constantly about food security, about the role of animal products. I think that we should all be aware of that, even if just to stay informed. And that could be a topic for a different discussion related to what animal products do or don't to humans. But I think those resources are also out there and people should be more aware of that, because we can also stay on the microcosmos of animal production, But because we have impacts on society, I think that we should be looking out every once in a while, right?
Well said. All right. What about your favorite book or resource outside of agriculture?
Books I like about different topics. Most of them related to biology and evolutionary biology. So I tend to recommend things that are in the social behavior sciences. Like
Okay.
I'm reading. Actually, I have it right here. I'm reading Franz de Waal, which is Mama's Last Hug. How we can learn about how humans work and human emotions based on studying animals. This is research like that I like. And the other thing is, what was it? Oh, it's more nerdy probably, which is a book that is called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. I don't think that this is light reading, like just before bed or something, but still, I think it's important that we are aware of how ideas circulate in society, what is a paradigm, and people to understand that in science things can change, right? Because it seems that we have been becoming increasingly, I don't know how to say this, polarized or tribalized. Like this is the idea, then you cannot even change your mind, right? So understanding that the mindset and the understanding can change, it's an important thing. So if anything, I recommend that book. Maybe not for everyone, but
I read that 20 years ago. I'm trying to remember who the author was. Or is.
Thomas Kuhn.
Kuhn. There we go. Yeah.
Yeah. If anything, just to understand that, we should be more flexible with what we expect science to do, because now we can say science for anything we want to claim, but science in principle is something that changes, right? It's self-correcting. And I think that book is a good reminder of that.
It's not a magic wand to make somebody stop arguing with you, because
right. And that could also mean that we are more aware of our biases, and maybe I see that ketosis are a great thing today. It's a great thing today, or ketones are a great thing, and maybe tomorrow I have to record another podcast and say, hey Barry, I was wrong. We have been right all along, and so that's fine. We should be able to do that, right?
Yep. I think a good scientist has to learn humility very early, right? Because most of our predictions are wrong in the end.
Yeah, we need to explore. That's fine, but we need to be prepared to be wrong, and that's not easy because we're human.
Yep. Good answers. Okay. Last question. In your opinion, what sets successful dairy professionals apart from those who are less successful?
I guess from what I've seen, and I have dairy farmer friends too, they have a relentless drive and love for what they do.
Yep.
So I guess it applies to many other things in life, but I've seen families whose tradition is so important to them, and they don't want to lose it, right? Even though there's so much migration from rural areas to cities, and everyone's just finding shiny things outside. They still keep this passion and love for it, and that keeps them interested. That keeps them, in many cases, open-minded and progressive into understanding what they could do better. And so if I see that combination of hard work and deep-rooted interest, I think that those are the ones that do better, right? Because they know what they have to do and they are flexible to adapt. So yeah, in my limited experience, at least in the US, that's what I've seen that makes people more successful. Being well-informed is very important, so they know where to put their priorities on.
Yep.
Right?
Well, good deal. Eduardo, I really enjoyed this conversation. So again, thanks to Dr. Eduardo Rico for joining us today from the University of Maryland. I hope we can have you back sometime.
Great, that'll be amazing. Thank you, Barry.
And if you'll agree to it, maybe we can start off the next episode. You can be playing like the Flight of the Bumblebee on trumpet or flute or whatever you want.
Or both.
Okay, both at once. That'd be great.
Easy peasy. Well, thank you for having me. That was very enjoyable.
I enjoyed it as well. Well, thanks again. This has been another episode of the Dairy Podcast Show. If you haven't liked it or followed it yet, please click that button so you don't miss the next episode. And we will see you next time.